So we have a person to kick off the conference as our, I'll label it, keynote speaker, who's Sharon Solomon. Sharon's the wife of Paul Solomon, and she has been dedicated to this organization for a long time. She recently got back from Japan, where she's literally created the group out there that's been functioning for a number of years. And on Sunday, we're going to actually hear from those people talking about what they're doing out there. So she currently serves as the chairperson of the Virginia Beach Fellowship Pastoral Council and is the recording secretary on the board of directors. And she does classes here. She's running an ILC class that we've been getting some real neat folks coming to. And it's really exciting energy that she's been creating. And so without further ado, Sharon Solomon.
Welcome to the 50th anniversary of the Fellowship of the Inner Light. It's really an honor for me to be here. 50 years ago, Paul Solomon sat in a bar with his friend Harry and lamented about his life. He was going through a dark night of the soul. 5 years before, he was on his way to becoming a Baptist minister, following in the path of his father, his grandfather, and all of his uncles. Then overnight, it all fell apart when his wife left him, because in the 60s, there was no such thing as a divorced Southern Baptist minister. Paul had spent 5 years in rebellion of his fate. And in his words, if there is anything that he didn't do during that time, drinking, smoking, drugs, women, all the things that a good Southern Baptist boy would never do, it was just because he didn't think of it. On this day in 1972, working as a manager of a fast food restaurant, he felt like he was like a hamster on a treadmill, always running and going nowhere. He was sitting in a bar telling Harry about a moment, his friend Harry, about a moment of hope when he approached a hypnosis clinic, but he just couldn't afford it. When Harry said, "I hypnotized someone once," Paul said, "Let's go." Most of you have heard the story many times. Harry led Paul through a boring hypnosis routine when suddenly the hypnotized man jerked violently and a powerful voice began to speak. You have not attained sufficient growth or spiritual awareness to understand contact with these records. Would you recognize him who you do not know, have not been familiar with? And thus began the Paul Solomon readings. Paul learned that what he had contacted was the rest of his mind. The voice for the readings, which was later called the source, explained, the mind that you think of as your mind is just the tip of the iceberg. There is much more to your thinking ability than that. The mind that you ordinarily think with is a result of your 5 external senses, observing the world around you and making judgments about what it sees, hears, and feels. It gathers information and makes logical conclusions. The mind is external, a body phenomenon, a result of the brain functioning. But this mind is not the sum of your intelligence. There is also an intelligence that is inherently in you, that is not the result of brain functioning. It is the cause of brain functioning. The voice that you are talking with is higher consciousness, the greater consciousness within you. It is the source of your brain functioning, the source of your mind, that which gave birth to your mind. It is also the source of your body. It pre-existed your body. It made decisions about the color of your hair and eyes, about the physical characteristics of your physical body. Its relationship to God might best be described as the child of God, or the only son that God ever had. If this is the source of our consciousness, the part of us that preexisted our body is the only son that God ever had, Paul and Harry wondered. What about Jesus Christ? And the source said, not only Jesus, but others have experienced the fact that God gave birth to only one child. When one gives up individual identity, when one no longer thinks of himself as separate from other people, he too knows that he is the only son. It is that same son you speak with when you call him by the name of Jesus Christ. Though you don't have to be religious to communicate with the source of your being, this is not a humanistic approach. The source further explained, the intelligence that made you is an aspect of God that lives within you. And it is so close to you that it is co-inhabiting the same body that you live in. What an incredible concept for a young Southern Baptist man. Paul was told he could discover the rest of his mind, and he spent the rest of his life doing just that, and helping hundreds of thousands of others do the same. And that is why we are here today, and why so many of us have also dedicated our lives to the same purpose, to discover this source called higher mind, super consciousness, living love, the inner self-helper, the Christ within. Paul and Harry began reading the Bible and studying the Search for God books from the Edgar Cayce material. They started a regimen of diet and exercise, which the voice had advised them to do. Several times a day, Harry would lead Paul into a hypnotic state where they would ask questions. The answers were strange and puzzling to them. They still hadn't the foggiest notion of what was really happening. They had never heard of channeling or psychic readings. All their lives, they had been told that fortune tellers were of the devil. They believed that the last prophets died in biblical times. They didn't know about spiritualism or out-of-body experience and haven't even considered the possibility of reincarnation. These topics were never mentioned in a Baptist home. And if you asked about them in seminary, it was grounds for being expelled. Yet the voice spoke of these topics. Suddenly, subjects totally outside of their realm of knowledge had become part of their experience. Still, Paul and Harry continued with their daily procedure. Harry would lead Paul through the hypnosis routine. Paul would go through a tunnel. Then he would go into a trance state and lose consciousness. Day after day, they continue asking questions and receiving answers from the source while in the trance state. They tried to think of intelligent questions. What are the things the world most needs to know? They wondered. They ran out of questions eventually, and one day just asked, tell us everything we need to know. But the source said, it is not meant that we should lead you by the hand, but it is by asking questions that you unlock this source of information. So they tried to think of the smartest question they could ask. One of the questions that they asked, said Paul, was simply, what is God? They thought they would get a whole book, but the source answered with one sentence. A God is a being who can recognize good without evil as a point of reference. Let me repeat that. A God is a being who can recognize good without evil as a point of reference. After that first experience, the readings became all-consuming for Paul. He spent most of his daylight hours in an unconscious state, and as more people learned about the readings, people flocked to his home. He wanted to help them all, but he still had to go to work at his job at the restaurant. He consulted with his father, as he often did when he was seeking a spiritual mentor. His father advised him to quit his job and to claim God's promise that if you do his work, he will support you. And so Paul quit his job, and everyone wondered what he was doing. Some thought he was crazy, but he said, it's God's problem. He's got to take care of me. Still, he didn't have any money, and the food ran out. He had been living mostly on peanut butter, and that was the last thing in the cupboard. He didn't even like peanut butter. And even that was disappearing because everyone who came and went from the house ate some peanut butter. When the peanut butter ran out, Paul decided to fast. I decided to fast until God sent me something to eat, he said. After almost a week of fasting, he was pretty uncomfortable. At that time, a friend of his was staying at his house because of his interest in the readings. His money had run out too, at the same time that Paul had, but he was an astrologer. And when people would come to the house and get into conversations with him, he would say, there was a lot he could tell them. Let's go to the pancake house and discuss it, he would say. And so he was eating regularly. Paul couldn't do that. And when Paul quit his job, his friends kept asking, what are you going to do? And Paul would tell them, as I understand it, if you do God's work, he'll feed you. His friend didn't think Paul was very responsible in his thinking, but Paul maintained his belief and kept fasting. Then he had enough. I'm going to eat, he said. The pancake house was only a couple of blocks away, and they just walked there. He said later, if my astrologer friend hadn't been with me, I probably would have chickened out and gone back home. But I had stuck my neck out and I wasn't going to back down, Paul said later. As it turned out, God didn't wait until he ordered at the pancake house. When Paul got to the edge of the parking lot, there was a $5 bill waiting for him on the ground. So he picked it up and went inside and ate. At that time, $5 could buy a meal. That perhaps was the most important meal of my life, Paul said. Finding that money was confirmation that he had made the right decision to quit his job. Since that time, he never doubted again that God would support him as long as he continued to do God's work. And although through the years, God did wait pretty close to deadline to supply the funding, as those of you who have lived among us those years can attest to, and he has supplied it in many different ways. Somehow, God always provided enough money to keep the work of the fellowship ongoing, through some of you, actually. At the same time that Paul was walking to that restaurant, the people at his house were having a meeting. They had realized that Paul was fasting because he didn't have food and didn't have money. They decided to form a group. They all chipped in to buy groceries and to pay the rent due on the house. Since they were spending so much time there, they decided to make the house a center. And so while Paul was having that meal, the Fellowship of the Inner Light was born 50 years ago. Forming the Fellowship of the Inner Light was only the first step. The next was the introduction of inner light consciousness experience, called the guided experience in spiritual evolution. Paul was inundated with requests for readings, for guidance from channeled spiritual communications. The requests were from desperate people. Some were ill with sickness for which modern medicine could not find a cure. Relationships problems that were destroying their lives. Legal situation that would put innocent people in jail, et cetera, et cetera. They couldn't find help anywhere. They all wanted help from this unique source of communication that went beyond the conscious mind and beyond the knowledge of the average human. Paul wanted to help everyone, but he knew he couldn't. Help was found through inner light consciousness. It began when Harry asked if the communication with the source was unique with Paul, or could could others learn to communicate as well? And the source gave a series of responses on Harry and others could learn to communicate. The source said, the phenomena of the rest of your mind, the superconscious, the greater intelligence, is not peculiar to one person. Everybody has a whole mind, and most of us access only about 1/10 of its capacity in daily life. Right now, cells in your body are actively dying. You are replacing those dying cells with new cells, new life, as cells are being reborn. The intelligence inside you knows how to make a new life, knows how to cause your heart to beat, knows how to heal you. That intelligence is coexisting in the same body with you. It is that intelligence that made you. It is the creator of your brain, your consciousness, your eyes, your ears, all of you. If that intelligence gave you the ability to communicate, surely it can hear you and knows how to communicate with you. That same intelligence is available to every person. Paul asked the source how to expand access to the teachings they were giving. The source replied, if a man is hungry and you give him a fish, you have fed him once. If you teach him to fish, you have fed him for a lifetime. Teach people to get their own answers. Use the information that you were given and teach other people to find the answers within themselves. Paul compiled the teachings he had been given by source for his own growth and began to present them to the people who came to him for help. Thus, inner light consciousness, a guided experience of spiritual evolution, was born, and Paul brought its teachings to hundreds of thousands of people around the world. Paul continued to give trance readings as well, and added the valuable discoveries to inner light consciousness, producing many more workshops and programs. In thousands of hours of trance readings for individuals and lectures for many, many people around the world, Paul Solomon has made available instructions on virtually every phase of human existence. There are medical diagnoses and suggestions for treatment which have been proven to be accurate and beneficial. There are prophecies which have been borne out in fact. There is a wealth of instruction in spiritual growth and enlightenment, and teachings of the ageless wisdom from religions and cultures from the beginning of time. Paul compiled the disciplines, the universal laws, the meditations, and the exercise in a complete system for the development of spiritual growth and abilities. Inner light consciousness grew to such an extent that the teachings could no longer be contained in one 10-night class. And thus, Paul developed the 12 workshops of inner light consciousness, weekend workshops which expand on the teachings. These workshops include not only spiritual development, but all areas of human potential, including self-love, unconditional love, emotions mastery, effective communication techniques, mastery of self-talk, building supportive relationships, dream interpretation, and healing. There are many more workshops, including a workshop on living saints who walk among us, the new science, and one especially relevant in today's world called personal disarmament. With the ultimate goal of bringing peace to the world, we examine how we have to bring peace in our own relationships with our family and friends first. One of the best love of Paul's workshops is Come Alive Bible. Paul deeply loved the Bible and brought to the world an interpretation of the stories that make them seem like we are experiencing stories of the biblical personalities as friends and relations with the lessons they face happening to us in today's world. All of the teachings of inner light consciousness, in fact, come from biblical teachings. Paul knew of the experiences of the biblical personalities who had changed their names to grow in their relationship with Source and with life. Jacob became Israel, Cephas became Peter, on which Jesus built his church. Saul became Paul. Paul asked the Source about this phenomenon, about being baptized and of taking a new name. The reading began by saying that what is given through this source is universal. That is, it is available for and useful for all people of every nation that would relate to their God. Then Paul was given his name. The source said, we would discuss then two nationalities. The wisdom that is expressed should be described as ancient wisdom and something new that is, and not something new that is being revealed, but that which is true from the foundations of the world, still is true and still is dependable. That the God of Abraham and Isaac, the God of Solomon, the God of the apostles is thy God, one God. Thus, from the Old Testament, the source chose the name Solomon, known for his wisdom. From the New Testament, the name Paul, described as an expositor, one who explains complicated ideas clearly. And thus the name Paul Solomon, the expositor of wisdom, was given. And indeed, Paul became all that he was destined to become, because he spent all of his time working devotedly on his ministry. He had a presence about him that lit up a room when he entered. Just seeing him, he drew people into his talks as if his lectures were for each person individually and personally. People loved him, and one of the reasons that was true was because he could see the highest and the best in everyone and treated people with the respect he would display if he were in the presence of the Christ himself. And in fact, he did see the Christ behind every person's mask, though some of us hid that presence pretty well. He could explain complicated concepts in simple terms that everyone could understand. And when he spoke, the room was electric with excitement. At the same time, Paul Solomon was a teacher of the mysteries. And when people came to the fellowship, they were often presented with their most dreaded challenges in life. People put Paul in their consciousness in the roles of their father, mother, sibling, or mate. They put onto Paul often the role and challenges of the people in their lives, and sometimes left blaming Paul for their own shortcomings. The teachings of the Fellowship of the Inner Light contain no doctrine or dogma. So Paul simply explains his beliefs. One of the most often talked about concept is the belief that the earth is a mystery school of life. Paul said, I believe you have a teacher. He has been with you all of your life and knows you intimately. He knows all of your strengths and your weaknesses. He knows what has the ability to frustrate you and make you ineffective. It is his job, in fact, to make sure that you have opportunity to overcome those things which have power over you. And he is obligated to make sure that such situations occur. Your personality is a collection of prejudices of the people you grew up with, much of it born out of their own insecurity. It is not your personality. It is a collection of ideas and descriptions and thoughts and fears and insecurities of people that were there as you were growing up. You picked their little beliefs and ideas and thoughts and descriptions and said, that's me. It's not you. It never was you, and you are not stuck with it. You can change it. And if the belief isn't working for you, change the belief and you will change the way you're interacting with that person. You'll not only change from an uncomfortable situation to a comfortable situation, you'll also learn that you are cause of all that you experience. This is your result mind. You have a cause mind. Paul's theory suggests that this cause mind does not literally make your decisions for you, but does create situations in which you can make decisions. The cause mind or inner teacher is so in control that no one can come into your experience that no one can come into your experience that without his permission. We can't prove this is so, but we can prove that if you assume it's so, that situations in your life are created by your inner teacher, it can make your life much more fulfilling and effective. The Fellowship of the Inner Light began in Atlanta, Georgia in 1972. As Paul's work became known, he was invited to speak, branching out from Atlanta headquarters. He was invited to share inner light consciousness in Virginia Beach, first by Tom Johnson of blessed memory, owner of the Heritage Store. Soon there were more followers of Paul's teachings in Virginia Beach than in Atlanta. And then Paul moved to Virginia Beach early in 1973. Among the first people to become active in the fellowship here were Susan and Billy Thomas and Sarah Anderson. During those early years, the miracles from the readings and from Paul's teachings were numerous. Answers on almost every conceivable subject are available through the readings and lectures. In individual readings, people have asked questions about diet and health, love, marriage, sex, reincarnation and karma, earth changes, universal law, cosmic consciousness, spiritual growth to the future of the earth and of man and womankind, and much more. The readings often diagnosed medical problems and recommended medical remedies at a distance. For example, one person was told that the tests she was given by her doctor were inadequate and told her doctor what tests to use to discover the cause and treatment of her illness. The source's suggestions worked to cure her. A young man who suffered from paralysis of the legs was given advice and help to learn to walk. While on retreat in North Carolina, Paul responded to a question from New Orleans, Louisiana, which had arrived by mail in a sealed envelope 200 miles away. After a reading in New York, a man told Paul, 40 years ago, I received a reading from Edgar Cayce, and you just quoted from it. When a child was stranded in a building in a storm across from the fellowship, Paul was observed walking through the air with the boy carrying an umbrella into the church service. Stories were told by different people of Paul's teleporting from one city to another, appearing hundreds of miles away instantaneously. One reading gave a woman in a distant city a block-to-block description on the route to a particular doctor's office. A reading gave a young man step-by-step instructions in giving physical adjustments to a man in pain and corrected the position of his hands, even though both were out of visual range of Paul, even if his eyes had been open. In the readings and lectures, we are told of many teachings of the source. Some are, if you can quiet the senses and listen, you will find that soft, still voice. The voice of the senses is a screaming thing. When you hear the still, small voice, then you know you have just climbed the first step toward your own higher consciousness, your God self. If I want to know what you are thinking, I have to care more about what you are thinking than what I am thinking in any given moment. Is my mind is on myself, I have no room to receive your thoughts. I have to begin by caring about you and what you're thinking. This is the secret of telepathy. If I want to heal a body, anybody, I have to care. Everything in God's universe operates according to God's universal laws, including God. In a time when scientists are predicting calamities and changes of the Earth's surface, when politics have become more bitter than ever before, Paul Solomon presents a refreshing point of view. Mother Earth is pregnant and about to give birth to a new age, a beautiful age. It is an exciting time, and while there will be difficult transitions, set your sights upon a clean earth with the accumulated debris of centuries being cleaned up. Look forward to a new heaven and a new earth. Emotion is goal-oriented activity. Emotion is not something that happens to you. It is something that you do. This is one of the most important statements that you will probably get from Paul's teachings. Emotions occur when you want to manipulate a situation to cause a specific result. If you can change your figures of speech about emotions, you will change your emotions. For example, instead of "he made me man," you can say, "I decided to be angry because I didn't like what he was doing." You have been taught in your culture to take information through 5 senses, and you have been taught that if information comes through any one of those 5 senses, it is valid. But it is perfectly natural for any human being to take in a great deal of information through other than the 5 senses. But when that happens, people say of the information, "That's just your imagination." And that phrase, "just your imagination," has caused you to mistrust information that comes from within or that floats to the surface. You have taught yourself that you don't have inner senses. The source said that for each of the grosser senses, there are subtler counterpart. And through the Inner Light Consciousness 7 Terraces meditation and other meditation programs, you can learn to access those subtler senses. Keep in mind that I am giving you condensations of things that came over a period of years, going back and asking questions over and over. Paul often developed techniques to respond to situations that were happening among the group of people who were studying with him. I have selected only a few of the miracles and teachings through the years. There are hundreds more. I came to the fellowship in 1975 after taking Inner Light Consciousness class in Wayne, New Jersey. I was a journalist by profession and thought I could write some wonderful stories about Paul and his teachings. I actually did, but not in the way that I originally thought. I want to tell you some of the miracles that happened to me personally. First, during my first Inner Light Consciousness class, I was healed of a bout of asthma by Paul's touch. In addition, Paul did a healing service, and contrary to what I thought that would happen, I, as every person in the room, fell down when he touched my forehead. Paul said the healing occurs when you can stop thinking for a moment and allow Source to enter your body and mind. I was offered a job as Paul's secretary, actually the greatest miracle of the time, although I didn't recognize it as such at the time. I was thrilled, though, and moved to Virginia Beach. I have had just about every job there at the fellowship, here at the fellowship, serving as secretary, administering departments, cooking and cleaning, travel agent, and conductor of the readings. A man once described the fellowship during Paul's lifetime as the most underfunded conglomerate in the world. And it certainly was true during that time. During my years at the fellowship, Paul taught classes and did tours in 22 countries around the world and gave lectures to thousands of people. Through the sale of audio cassette tapes, Paul's ministry reached, I believe, hundreds of thousands of people. One day, Paul was walking down a street in Greece and heard his voice coming out of an open window. He wrote books and started a community in the Shenandoah Valley, where we resided for more than 10 years. The readings and Paul's lectures gave guidance on the building of an ideal society, referring to the life of the Essene community in ancient Israel, whose purpose was to prepare for the birth of the Christ. We believed that was our mission as well. We were thrilled with awe and terribly naive as well. When I think about some of the petty quarrels over the dishes in the gardens, I cringe for my part in it. Hopefully, I have learned how to get along a lot better, because I think we will have the opportunity to return into a follow-up community in our next lives. At least I hope we will. Meanwhile, we do have community, not by living together as we did during the years at Hearthfire Lodge, but in mutual support in Virginia Beach and around the world. Paul said, "Our true mission is to build a beautiful family, a real family of people who feel related to each other. The family must extend across religious walls and barriers. This family must reach across socioeconomic and class barriers. We must reach and encompass the poor and the sick, the criminals and the insane. Every person on the planet needs to know that someone cares." I said I would tell you about some of the miracles I personally witnessed. The first reading I witnessed, all right, I'll skip that to the end. I timed it, but I guess I talked slower when I talked before you. All right. So I have been asked many times and have wondered, especially since Paul died, how to describe Paul as a teacher, a man, as a metahuman, and how to describe Paul's teachings. As his wife, I see him still through the eyes of love. I know I have been suspect because my love for him certainly influences my opinion in his favor. Then I found this description that Paul gave of Mahatma Gandhi, and I think it is a perfect description of Paul as well. Paul said, "Mahatma Gandhi was without question a great man. He was a man who lived his life in such a way as to change the course of history. Was Gandhi another incarnation of the Christ? The truth is probably this. For a few hours or a few days, on a few different occasions in his life, Gandhi was Christ. These hours or days on few occasions were followed by human inadequacy. So he was Christ for a moment, incarnate, alive, changing history. And a moment after, another breath, he was back into his unworthy self and knew it. And he taught it that way to his followers. So have a number of men or women who have been for a moment that perfection of who they are. And if they are in any given moment, only for 60 seconds, even for one split second, if we taste perfection, we taste who we are, and who we are is Christ. Paul Solomon taught that moment of perfection is possible for each one of us. May each of you be so blessed.